the Deversoar gap, continuing the secrets and concealments of October War. For further clarification about the Deversoar gap and the confusions about this period. The Deversoar gap is a battle of the glorious October War, which started on the night between 16th and 17th of October 1973 for an objective, but ended in a totally different one towards the end of the war. All along the post-October War period, and until this day, Zionism and the international mainstream media purposely limited October War only to the Deversoar gap, in an attempt by them to change our honorable present and history during October War for an upcoming generation that doesn't know about October War except for the Deversoar gap, blacking out all the victories which have been made before and after the loophole. Even all the amazing triumphs which have been made during the Deversoar gap itself. In this short simplified video, we're trying to introduce facts about the loophole to the audience in a simplified manner beyond any argument to empower the audience with a weapon of knowledge and awareness. Also to use such weapon against anyone might argue or distort our honorable and utterly glamorous history. The Deversoar gap is a military operation planned by the Zionist generals to turn the table of the war when it begins and to strike a siege around the units which crossed the canal and occupy Ismailia, Port Said and Suez to force a de facto policy, opening the Suez Canal as an absolute Israeli waterway. This is what the Israeli leadership planned after ceasing fire in August 1970, after the Zionist leadership was certain about Egypt's intent to break out war and cross the canal, even if the date of crossing was kept unknown to them. Though the Egyptian offense got delayed, Moshe Dayan, the Israeli defense minister, asked the chief of staff to prepare a new offensive plan in May 1973 for crossing the canal towards the west to occupy Suez, Ismailia and Port Said as a new expansionist Israeli dream, meaning that Israel was planning for a new war according to Moshe Dayan diaries, not to wait for the Egyptian anticipated offense. Back to the Deversoar gap, which started on the night of October 16, 1973. Based on a shift of the military status with a fatal military mistake by President Sadat, pushing the 2nd Army Reserve represented by the 21st Armored Division from the west to the east of the canal to develop the offense, which led to the destruction of most of the armored division outside the Egyptian air defense umbrella, making the Egyptian 2nd Field Armies back without any tank reserves to protect our forces back eastern of the canal. The Zionist leadership was recommended by General Sharon and Haim Bar-Lev's blessing, the personal representative of Golda Meir, David Eliezer, the chief of staff, and Moshe Dayan, the defense minister. The Israeli forces started to fold the 16th Infantry Division's flanks, began from the 14th and the 15th of October 1973 with an intensive offense on our 16th Infantry Division, the 2nd Army's right flank. And however the loss of the Israeli tanks was terrible, the dream of the Zionist generals was bigger than such loss. And indeed, the Israeli forces managed to start crossing the canal at the night of October 16th with amphibious forces and paratroopers in an extreme risky operation. And while President Sadat was chanting the triumph speech in the House of Commons, the Israelis made a step into the western bank of the canal. So Golda Meir rushed to the Israeli broadcast to announce in a major hustle and military mistake that the Israeli forces are on the west of the canal. And why not, when they are yearning for a victory to announce to the public, who tasted the bitterness of their lying statements and hollow promises of a swift victory against the Egyptian army. So Israel won the first bet, which was built on the mismanagement of the Egyptian leadership to the moving battle. The Egyptian leadership dealt with the initial information announcing the beginning of the Israeli forces crossing in disdain. Such disdain appeared on October 17th and 18th. So Egypt paid a great price for dealing with the loophole in disdain, as the 25th and 21st Armored Brigades were destroyed, along with what was left of the 21st Armored Division. So Egypt lost all chances to resolve the loophole. So the loophole got wider, and instead of 30 tanks to the west of the canal, on the night of 16th, reached up to 300 tanks on the morning of October the 18th, with the crossing of a whole 3 operational groups. However, now the whole Zionist army had crossed to the west of the canal, so who's facing the Egyptian army on the east of the canal in Sinai? According to Group 73 historians' resources, the United States of America saved Israel through the well-known airlift known as Nickel Grass, reaching to 500 tanks in between October 9th to the 15th, enabling Israel to compensate a large part of its tanks' loss on the Egyptian front line. Furthermore, it started later on to form new units to face the Egyptian army eastern of the canal. On the other hand, at the Egyptian front line, Egypt did not receive any new tanks from its Arab allies nor from the Soviet Union. The Israeli army operational groups tried to advance towards Ismailia, and General Sharon failed with his tanks and paratroopers to reach Ismailia by God's grace. Then the fierce resistance of the Egyptian paratroopers and commandos in battles described as battles of flesh against steel. But the flesh triumphed and the steel melted at the gates of Ismailia on October 22nd. And Sharon's dream to occupy Ismailia ended. As for the south, Generals Edan and Magen advanced, leading 2 complete multi-operational groups under sweeping air superiority by non-Israeli pilots and aircrafts, advanced towards Suez city borders and formed the blockade, failing to invade it on October 24, 1973 by God's grace and the resistance of the 3rd Field Army, Popular Resistance and the city police. Their casualties, as they announced, reached more than 300 deaths in this battle only.
בשלב מסוים התחילו לירות עלינו חיילים מצרים כל הזמן עברו את הכביש. הם היו במרחק של 300 או 400 מטר מאיתנו. אני יורה עם עוזי, לא מגיע. ובעצם באותו רגע אני הבנתי שאנחנו צריכים להסתתר היטב בחדר. כמה שניות אחרי זה RPG פגע מתחתיי. אי אפשר לנשום, הכל אפר ואפר. הגרוע מכל, היד, בעצם אני מרגיש שהיא עפה ממני, והיא כואבת, ואני מדמם בכל הגוף, יש לי פגיעות בכל הגוף. ניסינו לצעוק לצד השני, להגיד שנפצענו ושיבואו לחלץ אותנו. אף אחד ממול לא שומע אותנו, אנחנו רק שומעים שיורים כל הזמן. השלב הבא זה באים להרוג אותנו. אני לבד והשם יתברך. זה היה הקטע הכי קשה. אני קצין. אני דור של 70-73 של המבצעים הכי הירואיים של צה"ל. בביירות, בטריפולי, בלבנון, מבצע שדואן. זה גדלנו ופתאום אתה כלום, אתה אפס. ישבתי בפינת החדר ואתה מחכה לסוף. רימון ביד, אמרתי לחברים שזה מה שנשאר לנו לעשות ונחכה.
The Israeli forces, on the morning of October 25th, reached the worst military situation the military forces could be held at. In spite reaching to the 101 kilometer from Cairo, it found itself facing the 4th Armored, blocking its route for any further expansion. So the Israeli forces turned to defense after failing to achieve any of its military objectives. And so the Israeli forces found itself in a desperate situation, for its supply lines as far as 400 kilometers from Beersheba to Suez City through one-lane, non-secured routes and exposed to the Egyptian Air Force and artillery, which means that the Zionist supply line western of the canal is insecure and threatened. There's no more accurate and eloquent description than the British colonel and historian Edgar Oberlins in his great book about October War, No Victor, No Vanquished, as he described the military status at the loophole as, we can say that each party of the conflict described their situation as enclosing the enemy, while the enemy enclosed them. We were enclosing them, and they were enclosing us. In the beginning, we've mentioned that the loophole started with an objective but ended in a totally different one. It started targeting the invasion of the canal cities and securing the Suez Canal to be their own, and threatened the Delta and Cairo, creating a de facto status, and ended with the Israeli forces enclosed from most directions by Egyptian forces, and later on by Arabian forces when Algerian, Moroccan, and Sudanese enforcements arrived to the front line after the combat finished, which helped Egypt to compose a mixed Arabian division contributing with the Egyptian forces that have been redistributed western of the canal to strangle the Israeli forces. As the Egyptian common tongue says, "Let go and I'll do so," as the first to surrender is the loser. On one hand, the Israeli forces blockades the Third Army forces eastern of the canal, which was called Badr forces under the commandment of the Brigadier General Ahmed Badawi, denying them enforcements and blockading them from all directions. On the other hand, the Egyptian forces blockading the Zionist forces western of the canal from all directions except for the narrow passage stretching from the Deversoar in only 7 kilometers width, which urged the Zionist army to make a rock bridge on the Suez Canal, which Field Marshal Abu Ghazala called in his book the Zionist Escape Bridge, where it's a bridge set to undertake the Egyptian artillery and air force striking to secure the Zionist forces' swift withdrawal. With time pressing on and the cease firing on October 25, 1973, the battle kept going on at the negotiations table of the 101 Kilo Parley. At a time when Egypt started the second war of attrition through artillery shelling and raiding operations by commandos and paratroopers against the Israeli forces western of the canal, reaching 574 skirmishes along this period. Zionist aircrafts dropped down and their tanks were extremely devastated during this period, as the Third Army did not and will not surrender. On the contrary, it advanced and freed new land eastern of the canal, and Suez and Ismailia did not fall, while their forces suffered extreme daily loss. Even more, Egypt started to prepare a plan for resolving the loophole by the name Wasil Plan, which developed to Shamil Plan, and great forces assembled for it eastern and western of the canal. The air defense returned back to its full efficiency to protect the battlefield, so the military status became very bad for the Israeli forces, which according to Egyptian officers' statements who were inside the loophole, started to beg for food from people in villages and hamlets located within the loophole. At the same time, the Egyptian military status turned to offense once again, after the Israeli forces were pinned down and couldn't advance anywhere. Moshe Dayan declared a bizarre statement that the Egyptian army completed establishing the Fourth Field Army, which wasn't true for a fact, but a statement of a frightened and terrified from the Egyptian next move after tasting the bitterness of fighting against the Egyptian army all along the war and through the unequal flesh against steel battles. Only here the Deversoar battle turned from a lost military battle for both sides to a media battle, where the Zionists won a big victory until today. The Egyptian and Arab civilians swallowed the bait thrown to them on the social media and appeared a generation who doesn't know about October war except for the loophole and the big Israeli victory at the loophole. Such media direction of the Zionist big victory went further by what was broadcasted by mean entities about the military argument between Sadat and Shazli, putting it under the media spot every year on the day of triumph as if the war is limited to this event. Even more, all the Egyptian victories and championships before, during and after the loophole were limited down to a false Zionist victory. The Zionist military critical situation in the loophole pushed Henry Kissinger rushing to Aswan to meet President Sadat, triggering a warning from the American sole-known father of the international Zionism that America will not allow the Russian weapon to win over the American weapon one more time, meaning that he admits our first triumph of the war and will not allow its repeat, forgetting that who's holding the weapon is the one who triumphed, not just the weapon. Wherein President Sadat, the Egyptian fox, the political genius, and the humble militarily moved in an utterly successful political attempt, turning the American warning into a political maneuvering against the Zionist side. For if they don't want war or the Egyptian triumph, this time upon resolving the loophole and even before shooting a single shot, this time they have to withdraw from the loophole without withdrawal of the Egyptian forces eastern of the canal and offered them a Dane that everyone thought of as a Dane of a week, but it was a Dane of a maneuvering sly. He turned back their POWs in Winsayet pajamas in a humiliating scene in front of the whole world cameras, reminding everyone of the Jewish cloths at the Nazi concentration camps, and opened Bab el-Mandeb Strait for them after being closed for more than a month by the Egyptian Navy. So the Israeli forces withdrew from the loophole, raising cursing and swearing signs against their leaders, whom led them to a miscalculated adventure, as the flaccidity of the commanders with the officers and soldiers' casualties to achieve political and media objectives and to conceal their defective extreme casualties during the war. Also, General Sharon's statement is more than enough in post-war period that the battle he went through at the loophole was unnecessary.
ניסיתי במשך שעות על גבי שעות לשכנע בכך שאסור לעשות הדבר הזה. ביצעתי את המתקפה ושילמנו את המחיר הנורא ששילמנו. זה היה מהלך מיותר, לצערי מהלך מיותר. היה כאן...
The agreement stated that the Israeli forces withdraw existing in the west to the east in the heart of Sinai, while a part of the Egyptian forces hold its ground at the eastern part of the canal, at the sites won back during the war, while the United Nations emergency forces managed the buffer zone between both armies. The Egyptians got what they wanted from the war. Sadat had pragmatic objectives to get back Sinai. You can consider this a triumph for Egyptians. As for the Israelis, they have reversed the course of war eventually, but suffered great losses, which makes you see it kind of a defeat to the Israelis. Now, dear Egyptian and Arabian viewer, do you still hold your opinion about Egypt not winning October War and that the loophole battle was an Israeli win? Are you still seeing what they only want you to see without thinking? Don't leave your glowing history and the great championships presented by our fathers and grandfathers subject to distortion and forgery, and don't fall into the Zionist media trap.